This lesson is on dividing surds. We have already learned how to multiply surds, and dividing surds is the opposite process to multiplying. So for example, we know that if we take something like the square root of 5 and we multiply that by the square root of 2, then the answer is the square root of 10. And that is because the square root of 5 multiplied by the square root of 2, you can take that under 1 root sign, so it becomes the square root of 5 multiplied by 2, and processing the 5 multiplied by 2, what we end up with is 10. So in a similar way, if we start with the square root of 10 and we divide that by the square root of 5, then the answer we end up with is the square root of 2. Hopefully it should be nice and clear where that comes from, but if not, that is because the square root of 10 divided by the square root of 5, if you put that under 1 root sign, that becomes the square root of 10 divided by 5, and if we process the division sum underneath, then we know that 10 divided by 5 is 2, so the answer is the square root of 2. So let's take some examples then. So if we take example 1, let's take the square root of 8 and we want to divide that by the square root of 2. Now if we take that under 1 root sign, that becomes the square root of 8 divided by 2. We know that the square root of 8 divided by 2 is the same as the square root of 4, and we know that the square root of 4 is 2. So the answer to the root of 8 divided by the root of 2 is actually 2. Now this can sometimes be written differently, so it could be written as a fraction. Now please don't let a fraction confuse you. So if we take the same example, but we write it slightly differently, let's say the square root of 8 divided by the square root of 2. We can still take it under 1 root, because we know that the square root of 8 divided by the square root of 2 can be processed underneath the 1 root sign. So you put your fraction under the root sign, and if I take now the fraction inside, I know that 8 divided by 2 is 4, and that the square root of 4 is in fact still 2. So not to get confused if it's written as a fraction. Let's take a second example. So if we take example 2, and for example 2, what we'll do is the square root of 12 divided by the square root of 4. And again, I'll take it under 1 root sign. This step probably isn't necessary. You could potentially do this in your head, but if we take the root of 12 divided by the root of 4, that's the same as saying the root of 12 divided by 4. 12 divided by 4 is 3, so the answer this time is the square root of 3. And that's your final answer. Okay, now for example number 3, what we'll do is we will this time take 8 root 6, and what we want to do is divide that by 2 root 3. Now when you have numbers in front of the surds, what you want to do is deal with those separately. So the idea is, if we take the whole numbers in front of the surds, which is the 8 and the 2, then what we can say is that 8 divided by 2 is 4, and if we then take the square root of 6 and we divide it by the square root of 3, then what we end up with is the square root of 2. And again, for those of you not sure where that root 2 comes from, the square root of 6 divided by the square root of 3 is equal to the square root of 6 divided by 3, which is the root of 2. So the answer is 4 root 2. And your key strategy here is dividing the whole numbers first and then divide the surds. Now for example number 4, what we will do is we will take the square root of 72 and we will divide it by the square root of 8. Now what I would do is look at these two numbers under the root signs, the 72 and the 8, and ask yourself the first question, are either of these square numbers? The answer is no. So the second question I would ask myself is, can I simplify by dividing through before I take it under the root sign? The answer of course is yes, I can, because I know that if I take it under one root, as in 72 divide by 8, then I know that 8 goes into 72 9 times, and the square root of 9 is in fact 3. So the answer to the square root of 72 divided by the square root of 8 is 3. Now what some people might try and do is simplify each root first. If you want to do that, that's perfectly fine. We know that the root of 72 is the same as saying the square root of 36 times the square root of 2, because 36 times 2 is 72. The square root of 8 can be simplified down to the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. We have a common factor on the top and the bottom line of root 2. So they can be simplified off. That leaves us with the square root of 36, which is 6. The square root of 4 is 2. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. Now, I would suggest that this approach here is probably easier and the quicker of the two approaches. However, if you prefer the one on the right, in this situation it works in exactly the same way because it takes you to the same answer. Now, if we consider different numbers, so if we take as an example, so let's go for this time for example 5, the square root of 64 divided by the square root of 81. We could take that under one root sign and we could look for a common factor between 64 and 81. But what many of you will realise is that 64 and 81 are both square numbers. So if I take the square root of 64, I end up with 8. And if I take the square root of 81, I end up with 9. So the square root of 64 divided by the square root of 81 is equal to 8 divided by 9. And that is the easier approach here. Now, as extended material, you may come across questions, so as example 6, that look a bit like this. So 24 times the root of 72 divided by 5 root 2. Now in this situation here, you then say to yourself, what's the easiest approach to make? Now what you want to do is deal with your whole numbers first and then deal with your surds. Now if I was to take 24 and 5, I would say, is there a common factor between 5 and 24? The answer of course is there isn't. I know that then if I take the surds, which is the 72, and the 2, I know that by dividing 72 by 2, I get 36. And I know that the square root of 36 is 6. Now what you might consider doing is breaking this up into two parts. So if you take your whole number part and say 24 divided by 5, and then what we can do is multiply it by the third part. So multiply by the root of 72 divided by the root of 2. Again, 24 divided by 5 cannot be simplified. The square root of 72 can, because the square root of 72 divided by 2 can be brought under one root sign. That would become the square root of 36. And I know that the square root of 36 is 6. So that becomes 24 divided by 5 multiply by 6. Now this is a non-calculator question, so we would expect you possibly not to be doing this in your head, but to be showing working at the side. So if I take 24 over 5 and I times it by 6, what that means is I've got to do 6 times 24 and then divide it all by 5. Now 6 times 24 is equal to, so 6 times 4 is 24, carry your 2, 6 times 2 is 12, add on 2 is 14. So the answer is 144 divided by 5. So the answer that you're looking for then is equal to, let's write it to the side here, 144 divided by 5. Now this one is a much trickier example. It's definitely AB level, and it's definitely more difficult than most of the examples I would have seen at National 5 level. So maybe do one more like this. So let's take maybe one with a fraction that can simplify this time. So let's take a final one, for example 7. And let's say 6 multiplied by root of 112. And we want to divide that by 4 times the root of 7. Now, if we break our surd up into, or our fraction, sorry, into the whole number part and the surd part, what that means is we have 6 over 4 multiplied by the square root of 112 divided by the square root of 7. Now I know that 6 over 4, or 6 divided by 4, can simplify down to 3 divided by 2. Now what I want to do is take this second part, the surd part, under one root. So what I have is 112 divided by 7. Now, if you're able to process 112 divided by 7 in your head, that's fantastic. If not, a simple division sum at the side should help you to establish how many 7s go into 112. I know that 7 doesn't go into 1, carry the 1. I know that 7 goes into 11 once, carry 4. And I know that 7 multiplied by 6 is 42. So what I now have is 3 divided by 2 multiplied by the square root of 16. The square root of 16 is 4. So that becomes 3 over 2 multiplied by 4. Now, if you don't like the fact that the 4's are not written as a fraction, what you can do is write divide by 1, because we know that 4 divided by 1 is just 4. And then in the same way when you would multiply fractions, you do top times top. 3 times 4 is equal to 12. 2 times 1 is equal to 2. So that becomes 12 divided by 2. And I know that 12 divided by 2 is 6. So the answer to this question here, 6 multiplied by the root of 112 divided by 4 multiplied by the root of 7, oops, erases, is equal to 6. And that's your answer.